Ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to Asia Society. Our program will begin. Please take your seats.
Good afternoon, everyone. How about somebody at this table clink a glass? Would you do that? Clink a glass. It's our high-tech way of getting people to pay attention, you know. If I can ask you to take your seats, we want to keep roughly to time at least. Thank you all. I know some people are still trickling in. Thank you all for being here. I'm Tom Nagorski. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Asia Society. This is a very, I say this a lot from this podium, but this is a very special day for us and a special occasion. So we're delighted that you're here. It is first and foremost opening day for a landmark show of the Bombay Progressive Artists. That show has already won rave reviews. And not to pick on publications, but New York Magazine and the New York Times have just listed the exhibition as a must-see for the fall art scene here in New York. So you don't have to take my word for it. The galleries are open today. We encourage you to come pay a visit after your lunch, pay another visit, bring your families, tell your friends. It is a spectacular show. It's also opening day for our Season of India here at the Asia Society in New York, which we are doing in conjunction, obviously, with the exhibition, and during which we will feature all kinds of programming from now until the exhibition closes in January. Programs about India's rich arts and culture, about policy and business and current affairs, about India's film, its food. It's really a season about India's past, present, and its future. And its future is where we're going to begin today, in a way. Conversations about the roadmap ahead for this great nation. It's not, as you all know, uncommon to talk about the problems facing India. By and large, we know what those are. The point this afternoon is to try to imagine a future, a successful one, for India, and to share some thoughts about how best to get there. Put differently, an Indian economist said recently, quote, "India today is both a story of great revival and a story of great risk." So today, among other things, we'll ask how to boost the odds that at mid-century we'll be talking more about the revival and less about the risks. Hence our title today, India 2050. How this will work, we'll hear in a moment from a very distinguished representative of the Indian government who has traveled all the way from Delhi to be here with us today for this opening day, and who spends a great deal of his time and energy thinking about exactly these things, about roadmaps for India's success, although I think his time frame usually is a little tighter than 2050. He's thinking about next year and 3 years and 5 years. And then we'll have a panel discussion. We have a great panel here this afternoon that looks primarily at the business and investment side of all these questions. I do want to, before we get going, just welcome a few folks and say a couple of words of gratitude. Thanks, first of all, to our partners at the Consulate General of India here in New York, in particular the Consul General, Sandeep Chakravorty. Thank you so much, sir, for all your help. I should say, from the moment that we planned beyond the exhibition to do this, this full season, you and your team have been great allies and supporters, so thank you. I want to thank also our friends and supporters at the State Bank of India. Their head of U.S. operations, Ashwini Tiwari, is with us today. You'll hear from him at the end of the program. Thank you. Yep. I shouldn't have started the applause thing, but why not? Thanks also to our partners at the U.S.-India Strategic Partnership Forum, USISPF, their acronym. We appreciate their support. And I want to thank some special members of the Asia Society Global family for their support of this season of programming. Our trustees, Indra Nui, P.C. Chatterjee, and George Hicks, and in particular our Chair Emeritus, Chip Kay, who will be on the panel shortly. Chip, huge thanks for your support and for works of art that he has also lent us for this great show. Thank you, Chip. Speaking of family, I just said a moment ago I was going to embarrass her. Warm welcome, please, for the Center Director for the Asia Society in Mumbai. Bunty Chand, where are you? Oh, there you are. Sorry. I thought maybe you'd left the room because you knew I was going to do that. Okay. All right, that's enough of me. To get us started and to introduce our special guest from India, please welcome Consul General Sandeep Chakraborty. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Welcome to everybody. It's very difficult to be brief when introducing Mr. Amitabh Kant. I will just start with some very personal remarks, is that we are bureaucrats and diplomats and belong to the government service in India. And I can very easily say that if there is a role model or any inspiration that we look at in our service, it is Mr. Amitabh Kant, because I think, and his admiration in our government bureaucracy is very wide and deep. So we have amongst us such a person, and we are really honored and privileged that he agreed to come for this event. I would also be amiss if I don't thank Dr. Arvind Panagaria for his role in getting Mr. Kant to this event today. He is presently CEO of a National Institution for Transforming India, known as Niti Aayog. He was a member of the Indian Administrative Service, Kerala cadre, since 1980. He is author of Branding India, an incredible story. Mr. Kant has been a key driver of the Make in India, Startup India, Incredible India, and God's Own Country initiatives that positioned India and Kerala state as leading manufacturing and tourism destinations. These campaigns have won several international awards and embraced a host of activities: infrastructure development, product enhancement, private-public partnership, and positioning and branding based on extensive market research. Mr. Kant also conceptualized the Atithi Devo Bhava, Guest is God campaign to train taxi drivers, guides, immigration officials, and make them stakeholders in the tourism development process. Mr. Imitable Kant was also the National Project Director for the Rural Tourism Project of UNDP, which made a paradigm shift in spreading tourism to India's villages, which had a core competency in handicrafts, handloom, and culture. He was Secretary, Department of Industries, Government of India, and he drove the Ease of Doing Business initiative, and we have seen remarkable results where India jumped many places last year to be positioned just about 100, I think, and that process is going on. So Mr. Kant is deeply involved in the Ease of Doing Business initiative, Government of India, and also greatly involved in the digitalization and digital payment transactions that is happening in India. I would not like to get into too many details, but he has been widely recognized and awarded by many eminent institutions, and he started his career in the state of Kerala, and he held many important positions. But what is remarkable about his career is that the initiatives that he's taken continue so many years after he left those positions. For example, tourism in Kerala, the Incredible India story. We still use the slogan of Incredible India, which I believe was coined by Mr. Kant himself. And these days, Digital India and Make in India are making waves. With these remarks, I have the honor and pleasure to invite Mr. Amitabh Kant onto the stage. Thank you, sir.
Can I get this? Okay. Thank you, Sandeep, for those kind words. Tom, I particularly want to mention Dr. Panagaria, with whom I've had the great pleasure of working very closely in Niti Aayog. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure being with all of you in New York. So this great American humorist, intellectual writer, great lecturer, Mark Twain, had once said about India that it's the cradle of human civilization, is the birthplace of human speech, is the mother of history, is the grandmother of tradition, and great-grandmother of legend. And some of the greatest treasures are only to be found in India. So, ladies and gentlemen, this was Mark Twain much earlier, but if you look at India today, is growing at about 7.5% per annum. The rate is accelerating. Last quarter, we recorded 8.2% growth. But I think the challenge for India is really to grow at higher rates of about 9 to 10% per annum, year after year, year after year, for 3 decades or more, to be able to lift a very, very young population above the poverty line. Almost 70% of India's population, average population is about 70% of the population is around the age of 30. And this, to my mind, is the biggest social and economic transition that is taking place across the world. That the population across the world is aging. Across America, across Europe, it's aging. But the population in India is getting younger and younger. And the average age of population, as you'd see here, I mentioned, is 29 years. And India will remain a young country till 2070. And I think this is the biggest social and economic phenomena that's taking place across the world. So the challenge really is to grow at high rates, and rarely has a country with such a young population not created wealth across the world. And therefore, what is India doing to ensure that it grows at high rates for a long period of time? So first and foremost, I think India had made itself a very, very complex, very complicated, and a very difficult place to do business in. One of the key things which this government has done is to make India easy and simple. Its focus has been to do away with a lot of human intervention. It's done a lot of business process re-engineering. It's tried to cut away a lot of red tape. It's the only government which has scrapped close to about 1,300 laws in India. It's cut away a lot of procedures, rules, regulations. And India has jumped up about 42 positions in the World Bank's ease of doing business. And I think in the coming years, you'll see much more progress made on this. But India is a very large country. It's bigger than 24 countries of Europe, plus another 30,000 kilometers. And therefore, much of the action lies in the states. And the challenge is to make India, the Indian states, easy and simple. And one of the things the government has done is to rank states on performance. So it's ranked states on ease of doing business, it's ranked states on education, it's ranked states on health, it's ranked states on management of water, and it's made good governance good, equivalent to good politics. And what it has said is that the public must know whether a state is performing or not. So it's put out in public domain whether a state is performing or not. And if you're not performing, then the voters must vote you out. And therefore, it's put out all this out in public domain. So a lot of states, you'll see, are performing because they are being ranked today on a vast range of indices. I think the second critical thing to my mind is that while the rest of the world has moved into protectionism in a big way, I mean, particularly America, and consequent to that, reactions from other countries as well, but India has opened up. And if you look at the foreign direct investment regime of India, India in the last 4 years has opened up every single sector of its economy for foreign direct investment, from defense to e-commerce to housing to insurance to pension funds. Every single sector has been opened up. And as you see here, India's foreign direct investment has grown enormously. In the last 4 years, in the greenfield investment, India has attracted the highest level of foreign investments of close to about 228 billion. And therefore, India has opened up its economy. It believes that opening up the economy for foreign direct investment is good for it. It must be an integral part of the global supply chain. And therefore, I think it has attracted investments. I think the second key thing is, if you were to look at this Bloomberg study, on a vast range of indices, India ranks number 1. But I think the important thing for India is that as India moves forward, how it manages the process of urbanization will be critical. In the next 5 decades, India will see close to about 700 million people getting into its urbanization process. When America urbanized, land, gas, and water were all cheaply available. And because they were cheaply available, America had the luxury of living in New Jersey, traveling to New York, guzzling gas, big limousines. You had the luxury of creating cities like Atlanta, where 99% of the people travel by cars. So Americans made cities for cars and not for people. India doesn't have that luxury. Land, gas, water are all scarce commodity when the process of urbanization. The process of urbanization has ended across America, it's ended across Europe, it's nearing its completion in China. But in India, the process of urbanization has just begun. And if you go by the latest McKinsey study, 700 million people getting into the process of urbanization in the next 5.5 decades, the challenge for India is really to create two Americas and do it in a far more innovative, sustainable manner, in a compact, dense manner, in a manner in which you can recycle your water, recycle your waste. And therefore, truly the challenge is, how does India do innovative and sustainable urbanization? And I think, to my mind, this will be India's biggest challenge. And how does it create world-class infrastructure? So there's a huge opportunity. And as you see this opportunity in terms of roads, high-speed train, which India is doing, is creating vast number of roads, is creating 600 railway stations, is gone in for renewable energy, 175 gigawatts, it's gone in for 40 kilometers of roads, it's gone in for dry ports, it's gone in for industrial corridor. So this scale and size of infrastructure has rarely been created before. And therefore, the challenge is, how does India create world-class infrastructure? And I think this is one unique opportunity. I think the next big thing for India is to understand that this government, Mr. Modi, has had the courage, it's been bold, to carry out major structural reforms. I think the first and foremost major structural reform has to bring in one tax across the country, and that is the goods and services tax. And this has led to formalization of India's economy in a very big way. We've seen a vast number of formal jobs getting created after the coming in of the goods and services tax, and I think it's led to simplicity and ease in paying of taxes in a very big way. So goods and services tax, which has now settled down in many ways, has been a remarkable moment for India, where all states got together to create one single tax across the country. And this has been a huge process of political consensus making on a taxation structure across the country. And this has led to vast number of waiting vehicles at borders in different states being done away with, reducing the cost of logistics, etc. So GST has been a very big movement forward. I think the second big thing to realize about India is that India is the only country with 1 billion biometrics, is the only country in the world with 1 billion bank account, and it's the only country which is using technology to leapfrog. About a decade back, I was working in the fisheries sector of Kerala, where my job was to increase the returns to the traditional fishermen. And we provided outboard motors, crafts, fishing nets, but the biggest challenge was to open their bank accounts. It used to take me 9 months, 10 months to know your customer, and it was a real nightmare to work with self-help groups of fishermen. Last week, I walked into a bank using a device, using my biometric. I could open a bank account in 55 seconds flat. So from 10 months to 55 seconds has been the paradigm shift in India. And I think government has used this biometric, what we call the India stack, the Aadhaar, to push through a vast range of reforms. And it has led to almost close to 500 schemes of India. India used to be a very inefficient, when I got into the service, India was a very inefficient economy because it used to transfer benefits for poor people from the central government to the state, to the district, to the panchayats, and a vast amount of leakages used to take place. And one of our Prime Minister, Rajiv Gandhi, said actually that 85% of the rupee leaks away. But what the government has done is, it puts money straight into the bank account of the individual using biometrics, and therefore close to 500 schemes have been transferred. And almost 3 trillion rupees have been transferred to to poor people living below the poverty line and has led to savings of almost 9,000 billion rupees. And it's been a radical transformation in terms of sheer efficiency using biometrics. And therefore, direct benefit transfer to traditional fishermen has made India, to poor people has been a radical transformation in India's sector. So GST, DBT, and third has been the insolvency code, the bankruptcy and insolvency code. Traditionally, in India, businessmen could borrow money from any of the financial institutions, not pay with it, and get away with it. This crony capitalism is dead in India. You don't pay anymore, you lose your business. Cases after cases, this is happening. You don't pay, you get away with it. And therefore, this has required a huge courage, boldness, determination to bring in major structural reforms in India's economy. And fourthly, many middle-class people like me suffered. We could not get our houses because housing, you would give money for housing, you would never get your house. RERA Act was brought in. And therefore, all these have led to major structural transformation in India's economy. So bold, courageous structural reforms have taken place. The fifth point I want to make is that India is using technology to leapfrog in many ways. And as you will see here, digitally, we've created the biggest biometric movement in the world. That is, every single Indian today has biometrics. We have close to 447 million internet subscribers. We have the highest number of app downloads in the world today, 12.1 billion downloads. We have a very vast number of Indians on smartphones, but the rate at which cost of smartphones in India is falling today. Another 4 years, every individual will be having a smartphone. And therefore, what you are seeing is a massive transformation. And if you look at India's digital adoption, India's mobile data consumption today is more than the data consumption of USA and China put together. And therefore, what you are witnessing today is a massive digital revolution in India in terms of data consumption, in terms of app downloads, and in terms of sheer use of mobile telephony for digital payments. And each one of us is using our mobile data. We have a unified payment interface at the back. Every single bank is connected. And we use our mobile. Last 1 year, I've not used my debit or credit card. I've used my mobile to make all my digital payments. And my view is that all digital payments today are taking place through an app called the Bharat Interface for Money. And the Bharat Interface for Money, when it came up, did so well that Google came up with a Google Tej. It's an alternative. And Google walked away with 76% of this. And now WhatsApp app has come up with its new payment called the WhatsApp payment. And my view is that India will be the first country in the world in the next 3 to 4 years which will make debit card, credit card, ATM machines all technologically redundant. Every single Indian will be using mobile phones to make digital payments. And India will be amongst the first few countries to make this very major breakthrough technologically. So what you are seeing today is a huge amount of transaction taking place across highways, across all payments, all on mobile today. And therefore, using technology to leapfrog in many, many ways has been a radical transformation in various. And therefore, as it's shown here, India is truly the second fastest digital adopter among 17 major digital economies of the world. And if you were to look at the mobile data consumption, in the last 4 years, the mobile monthly consumption data has grown by about 31 times. 31 times. We've had a 7x growth in broadband coverage. And the tele density, which 3 years back was 75%, has gone up to 93% in just 4 years' time. So this has been a radical transformation in terms of sheer use of mobile, a huge amount for social purposes, for social, a vast number for digital payment, and a vast range of other activities. The next point I want to touch upon is that India is seeing a huge amount of vibrancy, dynamism, a very different energy in terms of its startup movement. And this energy is rarely to be seen anywhere. It's got the second largest startup movement. And my view is, having traveled between Bangalore and Silicon Valley, that there's greater connect between Silicon Valley and Bangalore city rather than Silicon Valley and New York, because a lot of investments from Silicon Valley is taking place in Bangalore today. And what we are seeing today is over 20,000 startups. Many of them, it's not just that in e-commerce, we have a Flipkart, which has just been valued at $21 billion, taken over by Walmart. But we're seeing some unique startup. One young Indian girl who started teaching Chinese, Japanese, suddenly discovered that the market was for English, and has last year taught 9 million Indians how to speak English, simply because no school or college has done this. So Pranshu Bhandari, 9 million English through an app called Hello English. When the tsunami happened in Tamil Nadu, it was one of our startups called Social Corps, which helped the government of Tamil Nadu to track all the stranded people, assess them, provide them food packages, etc., through the app. And therefore, what you're seeing today is radical. Or look at a startup called Baiju in the field of education. I mean, it's a startup in which Mark Zuckerberg has invested his personal money, but it's a startup which has done tremendous work in terms of longitudinal, latitudinal tracking of every single student. And therefore, what you're seeing in India today is we have a young boy called Ritesh Agarwal, and he's in 4 years' time, his inventory of hotel rooms is more than what Taj, what Oberoi, what ITC have. He has close to about 1,500 hotel rooms, which other hotel chains have taken over 50 to 60 years to build up. And that is the kind of movement which is taking up. So young energy, and I was quite surprised when the director of IIT Mumbai told me that last year, out of the students who passed out of IIT Mumbai, close to 50% either did their own startup or joined a startup. So you're seeing a tremendous energy in the startup movement amongst the young Indians, an opportunity which was not available when I was growing up. And the last point I want to make is that there's a huge amount of global innovation taking place in India. And global innovation started with Bangalore, it spread to Hyderabad, now spreading to Pune and Gurgaon. And many of the innovations that have taken place in India has happened for the world. I mean, if you were to look at the ECG machine for General Electric, which used to be made here for $35,000 in the United States of America, GE was able to do for $3,000 in India. It enabled them to do a ECG for $1 as compared to $30. All innovation on the back of Bangalore city. If you look at Microsoft Bing, it was innovated in India. Honeywell's turbocharger was innovated in India. The Shell has just done something unique. It's done through a process called IS2. It has done conversion of waste into petrol in technologically the finest way possible. And a huge Bosch, Siemens, Huawei, all the top companies of the world today have their R&D centers in India. And we have close to about 1,100 companies doing research and development. And it's not about frugal engineering alone. It's about excelling in the world. So John Decree's 60 HP tractor, a vast range of new innovations have taken place in India for the rest of the world to enable the world to benefit from innovation, technology, skills of India. So a huge amount of innovations have happened in this. And many of these, as I said, if you were to look at the unicorns from India, they're growing, they're expanding, and in many areas, Ola, for instance, has taken on Uber in the Indian market. I talked about Flipkart, Swiggy in food delivery. Many of them have done uniquely well. And if you were to look at Indian subsidiaries, they've consistently outperformed global parents. And I would give you the results here that they've done far better. If you were to look at Suzuki, if you were to look at Standard Life Insurance, many of them have done much better than the global parents. So what is happening in India, really? Indians are going digital. India is making business GST compliant. It's getting more and more formal. Indians are becoming data rich. And Indians will become data rich before they become rich. And therefore, you'll have a huge amount of data. And you'll have a huge amount of data on the back of mobile telephony. And this will enable Indians to do a lot of data analytics. They'll do a lot of machine learning. You have close to about 250 startups doing only data analytics. You have close to another 200 startups doing only machine learning. And what will happen as a consequence of this is that a lot of financial inclusion will take place on the, you don't need to go to physical banks. The days of physical banks are over. The days of physical managers are over. All this will happen on the back of data analytics, on the back of artificial intelligence, on the back of machine learning. And therefore, India will go from being data poor to data rich in the next 3 years. This will be the biggest transformation the world would have ever seen in terms of sheer data, analytics, machine learning, and our ability to lift vast segments of population above the poverty line on the basis of just data and our ability. And we are launching on the 25th the biggest health insurance scheme in the world. 500 million people, up to an amount of 500,000 rupees. 500 million people the world has never seen. We are linking up 150,000 primary health centers to district hospitals where they'll get digitally treated by doctors sitting in district hospital. The world has never seen this. And this will throw up a huge amount of health data which will be analyzed and enable medical records to be built up. So what we will see is a major transformation. And the other major transformation that will happen in India is the transformation which will take place simply because India has only 20 cars per 1,000 people. America has 950 cars per 1,000 people. Europe has 880 cars per 1,000 people. And therefore, as India moves to a sharing, more connected, and a zero-emission world, the legacy issues in India will be very low. And therefore, its transition towards a zero-emission world and its ability to move towards a shared world will be much easier. And Indian roads will not be just packed with cars, but India will drive towards public transportation, towards cycling, towards a sharing and a connected world. And therefore, the latest study by Morgan Stanley says that by 2030, India will be the biggest driver. India will be the Auto 2.0 leader by 2030, and every second car sold in the world, every second car sold in the world will be a car for an Indian in the world today. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I just wanted to show you that by 2030, if you were to look at the size of India's economy, India would be a 6.8 trillion economy. It'll be the third biggest economy in the world. And this is a study by the Department of Agriculture, Economic Research Service of the United States of America. But if you were to look at 2050, which is the subject of discussion today, and if you were to go by this PwC's analysis, India's will be the fastest growing economy up to 2050 in the world. And its rate of growth will be the highest at that point of time. But having said this, let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that India has challenges. India has several challenges. I think the first and foremost challenge to my mind is that India must push for greater levels of gender equity. India has a vast number of women who do not work. The worldwide average is 44%. In India, about 28% of the women work. Our biggest challenge is to create jobs, push for greater numbers of jobs. And if India was to only reach that level of 44 to 45%, India would be adding about $700 billion to its economy. So it's very important. As a conscious policy, men have to push for gender equality in a bigger way to push for growth. And this, in turn, will make a radical difference to India. The second key point I want to make is that it will be very difficult for India to grow at high rates year after year, till India doesn't become an export-driven economy. India has grown on the back of its domestic demand, but it's very important that India must become a very efficient manufacturer of goods. It's grown on the back of services sector, but manufacturing is critical. It must grow to size and scale, and it must actually manufacture to global excellence and must have the ability to penetrate global markets. Every single country of the world which has grown at rapid rates for long period, Japan, Korea, China, they've grown on the back of export markets. And therefore, India must become a greatly export penetrating economy, and that's critical for India. And the third point I want to make is which India is stressing upon, is that it's very difficult for India to grow unless and until the parts of India, several parts of India, which have not done well in education, health, nutrition, they make up for it. And it's very important that India grows with equity. And it's very important that we focus on nutrition, health, education in parts of India where we've lagged behind. And there's a huge focus on this. The Prime Minister's own focus on Gram Swaraj Abhiyan, that is people who've left behind to make up for them, saturating through 7 schemes of Government of India, and focusing on 115 backward districts. We don't call them backward, we call them aspirational districts. Focus on them to make them a very major partner in our growth story so that growth with equity becomes critical. So ladies and gentlemen, I've given you the pluses, I've given you the challenges, and it's important that India meets these challenges head on. Let me conclude. Let me conclude with this 14th century Indian poet. He was a Muslim. His ancestry was Turkish. He wrote in the Persian language. Muslim, ancestry Turkish, writing in the Persian language, 14th century India. And he counted himself to be the luckiest man to be born in India in the 14th century. And he said he was the luckiest man because, and he wrote, and he said he was the luckiest man to have India as his motherland. And in 14th century India, he wrote how exhilarating is the atmosphere of India. There cannot be a better teacher than the way of life of its people. If any foreigner comes by, he will have to ask for nothing because Indians treat them as their own and teach them how to smile like a flower. So ladies and gentlemen, the atmosphere of India, much like the 14th century, what this great poet Amir Khusro was talking about, 14th century, India today is going through a very exhilarating period. The atmosphere is exhilarating, and we'll teach all of you when you come to India how to smile like a flower. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Amitabh Kant, that was just a great presentation. Actually, great doesn't begin. You just used the word exhilarating. That may set new standards for exhilaration for a luncheon presentation, so we thank you. And beginning with Mark Twain and finishing with Amir Khusro, it was a great flourish too. We have time for just 1 or 2 questions, if there are some. You've put a ton on the table. And why don't we just, I'm going to go with first hands. You, sir, and then the woman there. We have microphones. If you can keep it brief and let us know who you are, that would be great.
First of all, great to have you. Your energy infected, I think, every one of us, and it certainly was inspirational. My question is about in a side, you made a comment about America being protectionist. So I wanted to explore that with you. We had the Marshall Plan to build Europe after World War II. Officially, it ended in the 60s, but with our asymmetrical tariff regime, the Marshall Plan has continued invisibly and has cost. We have really transferred American wealth from the world's largest creditor nation since President Reagan's time to now the world's largest debtor nation. We've literally transferred our wealth to every nation on earth, China, India included, because of tariffs. So I don't think we're really being protectionist, and I think because there is going to be the sea change, and the Supreme Court is going to change with Kavanaugh, I think, aside from one belt, one road, I think the biggest change on the marketplace is going to be America is not going to give itself away anymore. And how does that affect India?
See, Dr. Panagaria has been my guru. So I'm a great believer in the theory of comparative advantage. And, you need to look at the world as one single market. And eventually, if you keep protecting, you're only making things more expensive for the American consumer here. And you will discover this sooner than later, that if I have a comparative advantage in solar, China has it, or if I have it in textile, it's better to import that from India or from China, solar energy, and export what you are good at, rather than try and protect across the board. It will make things more and more expensive. So I believe truly that it's important, and I totally agree with you that several countries of the world have made it big on the strength of the American market, but also American multinationals have penetrated several countries of the world. I mean, multinationals of America have grown on the back of Indian and Chinese markets. So everyone, you need to do what you're good at and excel in that.
One more here. Reminder, we'll have time for more questions when the panel comes.
Robin Meredith, author of The Elephant and the Dragon. You gave a very optimistic presentation, and I hope that everything you said comes true. But I wanted to ask you for some specifics on the labor market, because you said you rightly named this demographic dividend that India has as a very big positive. But it seems to me it's only positive if, in fact, you deliver on the jobs for these people who will otherwise be, you will otherwise have great numbers of disaffected youths without a job. And second, and related, is you said you think that the most important thing is to push Indian women into the workforce. I also, of course, think that's a wonderful idea. However, the two of those things together are quite a big challenge. Could you spend a bit more time on that? Why do you think that you will be able to fix that?
No, one is on the, I made this point because I strongly believe that it will be very difficult for India to grow, and I raised all those challenges. And I strongly believe that it's very difficult for India to grow at 9 to 10%, which is what PwC is saying, for 2050, year after year, unless and until there's not enough focus on women. And you need to provide better nutrition. You can't do this in a situation where every third woman is anemic, where you have stunted children, where you have a lot of wasted children. It's not possible, and therefore you need to break this vicious cycle of malnutrition. And you need to lay a lot of emphasis on education and health. And I think what this government is now trying to do is to do this in a very, very big way. It's brought in some very radical changes in its policy for nutrition. And actually, the last couple of months, the Prime Minister has rolled out a series of initiatives across nutrition. We have a major Poshan Abhiyan to ensure that there's better nutrition. And I think he's personally monitoring a lot of what is happening in the health. Our expenditure on health used to be very low. It just used to be about 1.3%, but with this rolling out of Ayushman Bharat, it'll go up to about close to 2.5%, and then subsequently, in the subsequent years, it'll go up to 3%. And in the higher education sector, we've carried out some very, very major reforms, which were recommended by a committee, which was chaired by Dr. Panagaria. So major reforms on the education side, and there's a huge focus on learning outcomes now for schools at the lower levels. So a huge emphasis on social advancement. And I think the point about labor laws is critical. So the government has put in place, using digitization is put in place, this focus on putting all the labor laws together so that you have actually just one card. You are able to meet all the labor requirements through just that one number, which is through your Aadhaar. There's been an amalgamation of several laws together. So a huge amount of reforms have been carried out in that sector as well.
So we need to break now for a moment, but I know there are other questions. We'll take some a bit later with the panel. I share the questioner's optimism and that all of the predictions you've made and those great opportunities come true. But mostly, sincere thanks, Amitabh Kant. Please, warm applause for. Shane. All right. If we can have your attention, we're coming to round two of the program. I'm reminded by a colleague that I mentioned the season. I didn't get into too many specifics, but in addition to all the programs we have going on later today on the art side, and we've got a big opening night party here, which is free, by the way, if you want to come back in the evening. But next Thursday, the 20th, in the afternoon, the Jaipur Literature Festival makes its appearance here in New York at the Asia Society, so I'm reminded to invite you back for that. If I can now ask our panelists to come to the stage. Chip, Arun Kumar, and Bobby and Vinita, come to the stage, and I'll do the introduction so we don't lose any more time. I said it's a great panel, and that's probably understatement. I'll begin two to my right. Welcome back to the Asia Society, to Arun Kumar, Chairman and CEO of KPMG in India. Arun Kumar is the only person we know, and correct us if there are others, sir, who has both led a major business in India and also served in high levels of the United States government. He was Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Global Markets and Director General of the U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service in the Obama administration. In that capacity, he led trade and investment promotion efforts for the U.S. government and served as the International Trade Administration's lead official for advocating for better market access for U.S. exporters, something, of course, we've just been talking about. Before that, Arun Kumar was partner and member of the board of directors at KPMG, leading the firm's West Coast management consulting practice in this country. He also founded and led the company's U.S.-India practice. He was a Silicon Valley entrepreneur before that, and if there's any doubt that he deserves the label Renaissance figure, Arun Kumar has also authored a book of poetry called Plain Truths. Welcome to you, sir. Charles Kay, Chip Kay as we know him, on the far end is co-chief executive officer at Warburg Pincus, where he has worked since 1986. Being a former journalist, sometimes we ask dumb questions. I just asked Chip Kay. He said that today, 40% of Warburg Pincus business is in Asia. And I asked what the figure was when he joined, and of course, having joined in 1986, the answer is 0. He lived in Hong Kong from 1994 to 99. Was instrumental back then in the launch and development of Warburg Pincus's Asia operations, and that, of course, took him to India. You could say the rest is history. He developed a deep interest in and understanding of that country and also invested a great deal. In the last 20 years, Warburg Pincus has invested close to $4 billion. I think you just said maybe it's $5 billion now in Indian companies, a great range of companies, and the company has announced plans to invest much more than that over the next decade. Chip Kay currently serves on the board of the U.S.-India Strategic Partnership Forum, the organization I mentioned at the outset, and we saved the best for last. Chip Kay is also a former chair of this institution and chair emeritus today of the Asia Society. It's great to have you here. To Chip's left, presentation about startups and entrepreneurship. Vinita Jain is founder and chairman of Biotique, a company that blends Ayurvedic therapies with 21st century biotechnology to create environmentally friendly skin and hair care products. She spent her childhood amid the lush greenery of her father's estates in Assam and Darjeeling, and then studied biotech in Switzerland, and after that, attended the Stanford Business School. So that's a kind of Renaissance experience too, and that trifecta of experiences, and I'm sure many others I'm missing, have brought her great success in her native country and beyond. And our moderator, Bobby Ghosh, to my right, columnist, recently named member of the Bloomberg Opinion editorial board. He's actually moving to London next week in that capacity, so we're delighted. I'm actually a little sad because Bobby has been a frequent guest here and is a terrific moderator, and we love to have him, and I guess it's going to get a little more difficult. Bobby is an executive member of the Asia Society's Global Council, most recently served as editor-in-chief of the Hindustan Times. He was managing editor for Quartz before that, and before that ran international coverage for Time magazine, following, and I think these are all in your bios that you have here. He was a correspondent for several publications across Asia before that. We are on the record this afternoon. I should have said that before if there was any doubt. And the hashtag for you social media fans is Season of India. Please join me in welcoming this great group to the stage. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Since we are starting a little late and since we have such a distinguished panel from whom you will want to hear, I'm going to keep my role to the barest minimum possible. We'll start with about 35 to 40 minutes of discussion here, and then we'll throw questions. We'll throw to you in the audience for questions. We've picked a very ambitious topic, India 2050. That's a big time horizon. That's a nice round number. And we're being encouraged to think of what that India might look like. But since, as they say, past is prologue, I'll start by inviting our audiences to talk a little bit of the India of the past. And keeping in mind the youthfulness of the panel, we won't go 30 years back, but maybe 20 years back. And I'll ask each of them to tell us a couple of things that if we had been sitting like this at a panel like this 20 years ago, and they'd been asked to imagine the India of 2018, what are a couple of things that they would never have imagined possible that are indeed real in India today? So Chip, I'll start with you with the far end.
You know, I'm reminded when you sort of posed the question, there was a Rudy Dornbush, who's been an MIT economist, who said something akin to, things take longer than you think they will to happen, and then they happen faster than you thought was possible. And I've always thought India has a version of that, which is it's always gone through these versions of mood swings over the arc of time, where there's euphoria at moments in time that feel like everything's going to happen all of a sudden, and then there's these deep moments of deep despair. And the answer is always, in these things, tend to be somewhere in the middle. You know, I would say more broadly, especially as we listen to Mr. Khan, I would say the biggest positive development to me in India has been the political, now what I think of as the political argument for growth. I mean, you know, in many ways, I think India's history, in my mind, its single greatest accomplishment, not single, one of the most distinguishing elements is the fact, which it's the biggest surprise, but it's also the most obvious, is that India remains a coherent nation. I mean, if I look back at India's history and would say that one of the most unusual elements to it is it's been a remarkable exercise in nation building in what is a very difficult neighborhood. And you look back over that period of time, and the number of places that don't exist or exist in places that have much more true structural weakness to them, India doesn't. But I think its embrace of sort of I'll call economic reform broadly was always very halting. It was episodic. It was at moments when it was, quote, necessary. It was born of necessity more than it was born of full embrace. And I'd say one of the strong positives of the current administration has been that mass political argument for growth, for translating what is the demographic opportunity, but recognizing it's not destiny, into what is real opportunity for people. And if I'll pick one example, even in a shorter period of time relative to all of it is, and I think Mr. Kant sort of referred to some of this, I think India is well on its pathway to having what might be the lowest cost digital payments infrastructure in the world. And had you sort of said that that's where this was going to happen, and it was going to happen in a government-inspired public-private cooperative dynamic, I don't think anybody would have picked that. And I think we're on the way for that to happen.
Okay. Punita?
I think the growth of the IT sector, and in tomorrow's world of artificial intelligence, India has rightly positioned itself with the growth of its IT industry. So that's my thing that I never thought that, yeah.
Okay. Arun, what about you?
So I would say if you look back 20 years before you said, what are we surprised by today? That was intent of your question. I think the extent of Indian globalization and competitiveness, we would not have predicted 20 years ago. IT is a good example. This was before the millennium bug, when suddenly Indian IT people were all over the world. That led to them then riding the dot-com wave and really getting more technological. That's number one. Number two, take an industry like auto. In 1998, or a few years before that, there were really two cars on Indian roads, the Ambassador and the Premier, Premier Padmini, right? and it was a very uncompetitive business. They were very uncompetitive. And after the opening up, today India is the largest manufacturer of subcompacts in the world. It's an exporter of automobiles. The production of automobiles in India is just phenomenal. So I think that's an area where suddenly you would never have thought 20 years ago that India is going to be maybe the #2 automotive manufacturer in the world.
Yeah.
I think already Chip and Amitabh talked about the use of digital. I don't think at that point we would have thought about that. And similarly, amount of global R&D that's being done in India, 20 years ago, nobody would have really anticipated that. A second area I would look at, more on the political front, I think the level of India-US bonhomie and alignment, I don't think we would have thought about it at that time. At that point, India was not really thinking about the US in this open-minded, secure fashion. And that's very much something that happened over the last 20 years.
Thank you. So then, now having started in the past, I'm going to throw to the future. Given what you've just said, each of you, I'm going to invite you to make the most extravagant prediction you can make about what India 2050 might look like. Keeping in mind that in 2050, we will bring you all back on the stage and hold you to your words. Chip, where do you start?
Bobby, that's so much immortality.
No,
Oh, come on, these are all young people.
But Vinita's got a product for that.
And Vinita has a product for that. We can all moisturize.
Longevity.
Yeah.
I always learned, you give a number or a date, but never
Yeah.
both. So, look, I think the opportunity broadly that everyone sees in India is perhaps the only other place we can name in the world that has the potential to create another $10 trillion economy. And, it's roughly, 2.5 today. And that pathway that is possible over the next several decades to grow at, high single-digit rates on a sustained basis creates that opportunity. It doesn't mean that it is, as I said, it's not destiny, but I think that is the possibility. And I think that obviously says something not only about India, but to the extent that is true, or close enough to true, that has meaningful implications on the world that I don't think yet we've completely thought about.
Vinita?
I think in the 2050, the world will be will be dominated by artificial intelligence, where India will have a major role to play in terms of the largest number of scientists, engineers, and also what will come to really be a very important part of India's spirituality. The wisdom that India represents through the centuries will be of such importance in the world that will, where the human element that India will bring to the table in tomorrow's artificially intelligent world, where that's one observation. And the second observation is that we humans will be living very long lives by 2050. Longevity will be a key thing. And India is the founder of the ancient sciences of Ayurveda, yoga, and meditation, which is really the science of longevity. And our ancient masters thought of this centuries ago.
So we will be here in 2050.
Oh, I'm counting on it.
Absolutely.
Arun, what about you?
But let me pick up on what Chip said about the size of the Indian economy. I think 2050, India will be one of the top 2 economies in the world, just by the sheer mathematics of it, which actually takes India back to a previous point. I mean, frankly, as Angus Madison has pointed out, until about the early part of the 18th century, India was the second largest economy, if not the largest at certain points in time. So that's not new for India. But what does this mean in a modern global economy? I would like to think that since the United States and India are both founded on similar principles, similar ideals, I would like to think that there would be much more of a joint worldview between the two countries. Really, that India and the United States will share a certain dream, and that India will be one bookend of the Indo-Pacific, while the United States will be the other bookend of the Indo-Pacific.
That's a good answer. So I'm going to reverse the polarity a little bit and start with you. What is the single greatest hurdle to getting to where you see India in 2050? What is the one thing, there may be more than one, but the single greatest hurdle, the one that you feel that if policymakers, Amitabh is sitting right here, who has the ear of all the important policymakers of the country, what is the one thing that you would say he ought to be putting his attention to, that the one hurdle to remove between now and getting to the India of 2050 that you can imagine?
Well, I'd rather not look at a micro hurdle.
Okay.
I'd look at what can be
it can be conceptual.
the issue.
Sure.
What would I worry about
Okay.
in terms of the nice picture of 2050 that we all spoke about?
Mm-hmm.
What I would worry about is the increasing inequality. It was referred to by Amitabh when he talked about women, for example. That's a good example.
Mm-hmm.
But generally, increasing inequality combined with, again, a word that Amitabh used, with cronyism and crony capitalism. So the progress of the Indian economy along well understood rules of fairness, etc., if that's broken by the predominance of crony capitalism and the increasing of inequality, I think we'll end up with a country that has a lot of alienated people. And when you have a lot of alienated people, then history tells us that new kinds of regimes will come up. So that is, in my view, the worrisome scenario for India, that inequality and crony capitalism and cronyism, etc., take India from a different direction from the dream that I just talked about, which is a democratic, fair, free and rules-based society.
I think quality education, because I think there's India demographics, we have a young population which needs good, meaningful employment. I think what is seriously lacking in the Indian economy is quality education and the capability of our youth to take up good jobs.
Do you find this as an entrepreneur, someone who employs people? Do you?
Definitely, there's there's so many there's a lack of quality youth, quality educated youth. I think that's the biggest problem. I think one of the biggest successes of American economy is great college education, and we need more institutions like that.
Chip?
Yeah, I would say first I'd start by saying I think in the short run, India's issues are more domestic in nature. Its challenges are its own, and it states more in its own hands. That's not necessarily true everywhere in the world. I think in India's case, I'll come to the longer run, but I think in the shorter run, it has its own sets of decisions to make about how it sort of fulfills the opportunity that's transparently available but isn't guaranteed. And I think there's a whole slew of things, and you can come at it, I think as you were referring kind of at a micro level of what you need to happen in various ways. And the way I would come at it, I would say, if you looked at the demographics, India peaks demographically something around 2030, when you've got about a third of the population that exists somewhere between the ages of 15 and 35, and it has lots of nice dimensions to it. And I think that's the period of time over which it roughly needs to kind of step up to what those opportunities are. Simplistically, two things, I'd say, look, India's greatest strength has always been its talent, its people. We've seen that in the course of the just fantastically interesting entrepreneurs we've backed over long periods of time and people we've had a chance to work with and the like. But, the flip to it is while much gets talked about physical infrastructure, it's the soft infrastructure that's most relevant. Education, healthcare, and the like, and there's a lot of that still has a very bimodal distribution to it. Incredibly good at the high end and not particularly available the other way. It's sort of skewed in that sense. My own pet issue has always been land. I mean, I've always sort of said, the cost of land in India is broadly too expensive. It extracts too much of the rents relative to the path of economic development. And I think it's been one of those sort of Achilles heels underneath it all that broadly across a wide swath of things. So I think over the longer haul, to the extent we're all reasonably in the ballpark about the size and strength that India aspires to, I do think the global issues become more complicated. And I'm not as convinced the world is simple as somehow U.S. and India and this relationship that has lots of positive elements to it, but still is burdened with a whole lot of unintended consequence that kind of crops up from time to time. And China's the obviously other important player in this dimension. And we're at a moment in time where it's actually harder to imagine some of the more positive outcomes to that chess game.
So I think in that context, that's where the U.S.-India connection could be a balancing factor.
Certainly the U.S. would like that.
Now, I'm glad you brought that up because it's a perfect segue. Now, what is the role that you can imagine or you expect the United States to play to get to the point that you were describing, where the U.S. and India are bookends of the Asia Pacific?
Well, I think I'd go back to what Chip said. I think the real issue is domestically, how does the economy, how does India become a powerful economy by itself? So it's not so much dependent on the U.S. India has to harness its energies. And one of the things that I find in India, having gone back after 40 years in the U.S., is the tremendous energy of its youth. I mean, the people I work with, young, aspirational, energetic, wanting to learn, wanting to do stuff. So, you know, I just have this sense that there's a lot of energy there, that people who visit India always comment on that. Somehow if we can harness all of that, it can get the best out of the domestic economy, can become a major economic power.
Vinita, I'm sorry to make you the sort of representative of all Indian womanhood, but it feels a little inevitable. And I'd love you to address a point that Amitabh made in his speech, which is the low-level comparative to the rest of the world, especially compared to countries like China, of women's participation in the workplace. I mean, not only is the number shockingly low, it's actually declining. There have been a bunch of recent studies that show women are dropping out of the workplace in some sectors, which should be a matter of great concern for India's policy planners. Can you talk to a little bit of why do you think that is? If the Indian economy is doing well, India is modernizing, people are less conservative than they used to be, why are women dropping out of the workplace, do you think?
I think for two basic reasons. One is the Indian woman is very family focused. You know, when kids are born, you'll see a lot of Indian women leaving the workforce because they want to look after the children. They're very family focused.
But come back later, or
no? Then they just
gone?
leave. Yeah, then they just leave. So that's one of the reasons. More, I think Indian women or Indian parents are more focused on the babies. What my observation is than the rest of my experience in other parts of the world. And the second being the ecosystem. You know, the women, the infrastructure, the ecosystem, the safety of women. I think these are serious challenges, and I think if we have to make women more participative in the Indian economy, we need to see that she's more safe at her workplace.
And you feel that this has gotten worse than it used to be?
Yes, there has been a steady, the challenge has not been totally overcome.
Chip, from your perch in Hong Kong and having your close association with Asia Society, you've had a chance to look at both of the two big giants, India and China, very closely. Now, they are not both apples or both oranges, and I'll grant that they're very different. But what is it that you feel that, if I were to ask you the lessons from China that India, being a democracy, being a more complicated place, that India can profitably learn from and apply, and maybe the other way around too?
Well, I've always been a fan. I mean, we have sizable businesses in both places. I've never felt like life's a choice, and I think sometimes these questions around India, China always turn into this choose dimension. And I've never really believed that. In fact, I'm not really sure the two of them have a whole lot in common, other than they each mathematically have more than 1 billion people. But which, whatever, decent part of the world. But you know, I sort of alluded to this a little bit earlier. One of the comments I've sometimes made is I think if you were to if you looked at it as a pure economic experiment, I mean, what's gone on in China the last 35 years is just unprecedented, right? I mean, you've grown somewhere from a couple $100 billion to 12 trillion since the early 80s. That is a just awesome sort of sustained economic growth over that part of the period of time, and has really completely transformed that environment. I kind of referred to this earlier. I mean, if I were to pick, I mean, India is a nation-building exercise given disparity of language, ethnicity, religion in a tough neighborhood. Is, you know, maybe its in some ways greatest achievement. So I think they've played differently in some ways. if I were to go to your core of your question, I'd say, you know, without making a judgment about one or the other, but simply what they can take from another. A few things I sort of alluded to. I always viewed China as used land as currency to spur development. So the old style deals was, I want to go build a factory. Government would give you land, create roadway, train workers, and that was the start. Whereas in India, it's the cost of the land extracts so much that it actually creates it makes an uneconomic activity in many cases to go do that. It's one of, not the only, one of the reasons you've also seen, I'd say, India hasn't created the mass kind of low-skill, low-wage labor that starts the income cycle as strongly. And you know, one of the other debates we haven't talked about today is, you know, whether you really can leapfrog beyond sort of a core manufacturing capacity that kind of creates that dynamic, if you will. And it's not that the IT segment hasn't been wildly successful. It has, but it's not the mass absorber of labor in the same way manufacturing is. And I'd say maybe the last one on that topic is China embraced urbanization as a means of economic growth in and of itself. The mere movement of people from farms to cities is productivity enhancing, and it actually creates its own source of labor and economic activity. And I think for India that's been a harder transition in some ways. In part it's philosophical. India lives in its villages, and you know there's been this embrace of rural life as somehow the and it's been, in my view, kind of less committed, less clear. I actually think one of the issues, Mr. Consular referred to it, is the need to embrace urbanization in a more fulsome manner. And you see elements of that now, as he referred to a lot of them. Most visibly, in the short run, you see it in traffic jams as the subways get built in Bombay and in Delhi. So I think there's interesting lessons to come from that.
Sure.
Actually, if I might add a couple of points, I think, one is I think China, the way they execute at scale, which is difficult for a country like India, but I think may be possible for some of the state governments to do. So, like the Shenzhen that was set up, well, now state governments are thinking about doing those kinds of projects. I think that is a lesson for India to learn how to harmonize and execute at scale. Now, one of the things I'm really impressed with what China is doing now is their focus on research and the number of patents that are coming out of China. And now their big focus on artificial intelligence, and they're determined to become a world leader in AI. So again, a central strategic move and executing at scale.
Well, the only person on stage who's making things is you, Vineet. And both these gentlemen brought up points that I think you can expand on a little more, which is, as well as Amitabh talking earlier about Make in India. Talk a little bit about what it is like to make in India. What are the challenges of making in India, and what, if anything, stands in the way of your achieving the kinds of scale that Arun was talking about?
So to take up a couple of points that he said, about land being expensive.
Yeah.
I've always thought land has to be expensive. India has close to 1/5 of the world's population, but we don't have 1/5 of the world's land mass. So thereby, theoretically, land is expensive. I think the government is doing a lot to make in India or made in India much better. But if you compare it with just another example of China, the kind of support that the government gives to industry to be the world's leading manufacturer that China is today, I think there has to be more government and entrepreneurial partnership to see that India is more export-oriented.
What if Biotique was a Chinese company? Sorry to interrupt. What would you have got from the government that you don't get in India?
Well, at Biotique, I just did it. That was the only way I did it. I mean, at that time when I founded the company, most products were imported, but we did total vertical integration, that we manufactured all our packaging. I had all the plants specially grown by Indian farmers. So I really focused on every aspect of the business, and I ticked all the boxes that we took care of it. But I think it would be very difficult for an entrepreneur starting to tick all the boxes from the very beginning. But when I started, I was the only one, so I had to do it.
And if you were an entrepreneur starting today, whether or not you're a woman, how would things be different?
Well, I would get a lot more support. The government is much more supportive today. It's less bureaucratic. In the days I started, there was not much support.
As the head of KPMG in India, you get to see corporate India very up close, and of course you can make comparisons with corporate America, corporate Britain, other parts of the world, to the extent that you can make any kind of fair comparisons. What is the evolution of corporate behavior, corporate culture in India that you feel gives us hope for how things are going to go in the next few years, and what are some of the challenges there? In corporate culture, you said you went back to India after 40 years. I went back 2.5 years ago after 25 years abroad, and it was quite astonishing to me to see the change in behavior within companies. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So maybe break it up into two pieces.
Yeah.
One is on corporate culture. I think one of the strengths of India's corporate culture is that because they've been family-controlled firms, etc., a culture has grown up where people do take a long view. They aren't compelled by a quarter-over-quarter view. So I heard the story, for example, of an Indian conglomerate that bought a very large US company. And I met the CEO who had been headhunted, and he was coming out of Ford, and he said, and he told me his conversation was, he talked to the Indian entrepreneur, promoter, as they call them in India, and said, what is your time horizon? When are you going to flip this? And this person looked at the executive and said, I'm far younger than you. It's not going to be flipped in my lifetime, so you don't have to worry about it. So they were into it for the long term, which I think is a great advantage of the culture of India. And I find that seeps through, and people are willing to take a bit of a longer term view than you see in the West. Now let me come to the governance. For the same reason that you have families that control these things, you've got to pay attention to the governance. And there's more and more attention to that topic. I happen to serve on the Uday Kotak Committee on Corporate Governance, which really tried to figure out how do you make sure that you can enhance corporate performance, at the same time protect minority shareholders. So that's an ongoing journey. The good news is that SEBI, etc., are pretty much focused on that topic.
Just add a couple things. If I were to think back to your original question of what's changed the most over the period of time, I think back to some of the early conversations we had in the mid-90s capital was largely available to those that came from privilege. Mm-hmm. So either had privilege or you had access to it. And today it is much more widely available. And so, you heard the discussion about the entrepreneurial sort of spark running through it. And I think we see that. I mean, there are people now who don't necessarily have to come from something to dream of something. And there are means by which they can raise the money to kind of make that happen. And I think that, to me, has been one of the meaningfully big changes. I think the flip to it, which was also kind of got referred to a little bit, is the change as a result of the bankruptcy code stuff that kind of shifts the spectrum to creditors away from debtors is a big deal, a very big deal. And in the short run, it brings with it some amount of pain. It's one of the reasons you can look at some of the sclerosis in the banking system and make some argument about why there's not this CapEx cycle that we've all talked about for a while. But the flip to it is, those things don't happen easily. That shift is the idea that people now need to be responsible for the debts they create is a mindset shift, and long run it will serve India quite well.
I mean, you played a big role. Private equity has played a big role in professionalizing thinking about corporate management.
I remember, for what it's worth, I remember actually early having some conversations. Private equity, when we first got there in the mid-90s, wasn't very well known. And occasionally we try to go describe it, and we talk about, we want to find talented people we can grow and build businesses with, and we're not banks. We want to invest money into the business. And we had this great pitch, and I'd say occasionally after sort of having given it, we'd meet someone and they'd say, that's great, sounds really good, I'll take some of that. Now, I'm not going to give you any shares, you understand. I'd be like, all right, we really didn't do a very good job here. So these days it shifted quite a lot.
Okay, now we're ready to take some questions from the audience. Same rules as before. Please raise your hand so I can see you. When the mic comes to you, please identify yourselves. Please keep the questions as short as you can. And to the extent possible, ask questions specific to one of the panel rather than questions that they each have to address individually. Over here. Just a second, the mic's coming to you.
Hi, this question is for you, sir.
Could you please identify yourself?
Okay, I'm Dr. Bhattacharya from Sloan Kettering Cancer Center.
That's my bid already.
No, but one of the things that you addressed. So one of the things that, as we are getting into the fourth industrial revolution technologies, especially AI and all these, data security is a major issue. And then if you can just address either you or anyone else. And primary education and secondary education, especially science and technology and in fourth industrial revolution technologies, should be the focus with analytical thinking. That should spur the economic growth in rural, urban
So that's a
areas.
very wide band of things. So when you're talking about security, are you talking specifically of digital security?
Yes.
Data security?
Yes.
Well, without you, that's I think probably something that.
Yeah, well, we do some work in that space.
Oh, there you go.
But there is a lot of movement in the policy area, with the committee recently having been set up called the Sri Krishna Committee,
Yes.
that has come up with recommendations for a data privacy law. And the thinking of the government, there are three pieces to it. One is what has Europe done in the GDPR area, so taking the best of that. Then the Reserve Bank has its own views on financial data. And then the whole Aadhaar stack, which I've talked about, promotes a lot of approaches to data. And the Aadhaar stack, that whole philosophy is that the individual owns the data. So,
Are we going a little backward? Should the law not have been there before Aadhaar and things like that?
well, when did GDPR come in? Frankly, both Europe, US, everybody's trying to catch up with the technology. So,
Other questions? A question from the lady there, and then afterwards from the gentleman over here.
Hi, I'm Nancy Vardy. I'm from India. I've been here 12 years. I work for KPMG Real Estate. And
good.
you spoke about land in like land cost in China versus land cost in India versus China. In China, I know that you cannot own land. The government owns land. You can have like leases for 70 years or something, but you don't own. But in India, people own land. Do you think that is a kind of disadvantage for India or China? Do you see since land being so expensive in India, just
I wouldn't argue the issues of freehold. I mean, that's a legal structure. Lots of places around the world have sort of different dimensions of it. I was getting more at the economic cost as you think about anything from infrastructure build to where I put a factory to how I build out a retail storefront, to whatever it is. I think the higher cost of land, in my view, sort of forces businesses to a more upscale place. It makes it harder to create more kind of lower income product in anything you pick, and that doesn't necessarily, in my view, serve India well. Again, it's my pet issue. I don't know if it's the end all and be all, but to me it does sit at the heart of a lot of things when I look at, why doesn't India create mass, housing, hospitality, elements of the urbanization infrastructure agenda or manufacturing?
That's a big issue, and not only the cost, the time it takes to get the land you want. It's a huge issue. Really, that's not something important.
But certainly in the infrastructure, if you're trying to build things, that's going to get in the way.
I would say, just to have one positive point of view, since a lot of people in New York, we've all lived through the 2nd Avenue subway and the subway extension over to Hudson Yards. I did something recently at the back of the envelope. So India is now building subway systems in both Delhi and Bombay at approximately 5% of the cost per mile.
And faster,
of
too.
Of New York City. So.
And a lot faster, which is quite remarkable.
Now, that's a good thing about India. Maybe it's not so good thing about New York, but...
Rajiv Chowdhury, president of Sansara Capital. My question is about jobs. One of the nice things about India's growth rate of 7-odd% is that it's one of the highest growth rates in the world. The other side of it is that it's been almost a jobless growth. So good news, bad news, the economy is able to grow at something like 7% without creating jobs. And the question that I want to ask is, yes, the skill development is important, but in a world that is, as we've talked about earlier, is closing out, or at least the scope for world trade is shrinking, how will India generate the jobs to absorb 500 million plus people in the next 25, 30 years, especially, you can raise the skills, but you also have AI and automation that are going to be working against job creation. So what will these people do?
Well, I would say, first of all, the data on jobs is very suspect. If India is growing at 7%, surely productivity is not growing at 7%. So if productivity is growing at 3%, then jobs are being created for the other 4%. So I think you've got to be a little bit careful when you say this is jobless growth. And I would actually turn it over to Amitabh. So that's my first comment on that topic. But otherwise, yes, it is skills development is a very big issue. And a lot was said about that here. But maybe you want to talk about this because there's a lot of...
Could you get the mic to Amitabh?
He didn't ask if he wants it.
Well, they're good friends.
Bobby's just trapped me. So the latest EPFO study shows that India's, if you go by that data, it shows that India is creating about roughly 8 million jobs a year. The problem is not about jobs. It's not about unemployment. It's about low levels of wages and of underemployment. So you need to create better quality jobs. That's important.
It's also aspirational. The Indians who are coming into the workplace aren't aspiring for the same kind of jobs as they used to.
This issue about jobless growth is totally false. It's, as Arun said, it's not possible for India to be growing at 7.5% without jobs. We have several analyses in recent times, one by Ghosh and Ghosh, another by,
completely reliable if they have that name.
Yeah. That's why I mentioned. I was pretty sure moderator would appreciate it.
For a civil servant, you're a very good politician. Yeah.
And several others in recent times have established that adequate number of jobs are getting created, but wages need to rise up in these jobs.
One question here from another Ghosh.
Maybe here it is.
Ghosh and Ghosh. Yeah.
My name.
It's on.
My name is Chuni Ghosh. I have been an entrepreneur here in the US, as well as started a manufacturing company in the 90s in India. And I have some experience about the difficulties on the manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
And without manufacturing, I don't think the India's 8% growth rate can be sustained. I would like to hear from Mr. Kant about what is being specifically done on that front. I think this will need a massive amount of effort and massive government attention, to say the least.
I promise this is the last time we'll ask you to answer a question.
Actually, the government has laid a huge amount of emphasis on manufacturing and across sectors. I think the latest study, which has just come out 2 days back, really shows that almost all the sectors across the board, I mean, it's a study of CEOs by CII, of all the top 500 odd CEOs, shows that all of them, they've reached their peak capacity utilization, and they're all getting into fresh investments. So in future, I see, in the coming months, I see a huge amount of fresh investments getting in. I see a huge amount of capital formation taking place across the board. And government has simplified, I mean, the entire objective of ease of doing business of Prime Minister Modi has been that make things easy and simple for people to manufacture. I mean, the whole process of digitization across the board has been that, and the whole objective of pushing for GST is that India should become a very easy country for manufacturing so that the logistic cost falls very heavily.
Is that a point you wanted to make?
No, I would just add to that for manufacturing to really get to scale, we need to get the SMEs in India integrated into global supply chains. I think that is going to be very important because in the US as well, SMEs are the real employment generators. So to do that, it needs to be easy for things to come in and out of India. So there are trade facilitation issues, tariffs issues, which we need to be very watchful that those facilitate that integration.
There's a question first from the back, and then I'll come to you.
Hi, I'm Vanya Desai. You mentioned youth and education of youth. So I wanted to ask the panel what you think the core root cause is of lack of education across the greater, because we have such high education in India, but at a high level, but not across? What's the root cause, and if you were in charge of fixing the problem or addressing it, what would you do?
No, I promised we are not asking Amitabh any more questions. But as someone who employs people, you were talking earlier about the thing. Where, if you had to put your finger on the problem, what explains the disparity between the extraordinary achievement at the top end of the education pyramid of Indians, and then the sort of really poor quality at the base?
I think it's the lack of quality teachers. It's not one problem. If you go to some of these rural schools and even schools in metropolitan cities, which are a B or C class, lack of infrastructure, lack of quality teachers, lack of just about everything that makes a school or a college successful. We have the top tier, and then the middle layer is not so much. And there is the bottom layer, middle and bottom is really lack of everything, actually.
Maybe some observation in the US, we have the same problem.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, you could argue the U.S. has some of the same issues, and I don't know there's an easy answer to that. I think everywhere in the world sort of faces some elements of that. Some of it's clearly money and sort of the devotion of resources. But I think in most cases when people have done studies, whether it's here or in India, not taking scales, it's not just the aggregates, it's sort of the efficiency of how they're deployed.
It's actually interesting. I just
you end up with a lot of the sort of you end up with a lot of this that sort of ends up being that the overseers of these activities have, you know, skewed incentive structures around this becomes the stuff of you know, patronage and the like, as opposed to. So I think it's a pretty complicated issue, but I think it is maybe one of the most important elements that India has to address.
I mean, I'll give you an example in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
In San Jose, which is the heart of Silicon Valley, 60% of the Hispanic kids who go to high school don't finish high school. In San Jose, California. So this is a big issue. So that having those two tiers is a big issue here as well.
Well, India seems to be different in one aspect, which is that there is an enormous appetite for the education. Dropout rates are nowhere near that high. People are struggling to get their kids into school, and once they get into school, not talking about rural India, in urban India certainly, people don't drop out. They sort of stick through it. In fact, if anything, they may stay in school, including university, a little longer than they really ought to. That doesn't seem to be the problem. I was just going to use an example. I just recently, last week, went home to my hometown in India, which is Visakhapatnam in the southeast, in Andhra Pradesh. And I hadn't been home for a very, very long, many years. And so it was quite instructive to me. When I was growing up there 30-odd years ago, he lied. There were like 3 decent schools that taught English language education. Now there are 15, 20 even, and some of them are international schools. Some of them are, you know, Delhi Public School has a branch there. There are local schools that have come up. There's a huge demand for seats. Actually, that seems to be the problem. That this has become a transaction between people providing seats and people wanting to buy seats. It's not so much about the education. It's about just admission. And to the point that you were making, there are now 15 schools in my hometown, but the pool of teachers has not significantly changed. And so the quality of teaching in each of these schools has dramatically declined, although the number of people going to those schools and paying much more by way of fees has greatly increased. So there seems to be a huge gap there between, and I don't know if this is just a lag, whether, and you know, you may have to be an economist to get this, whether this is just a lag and whether over a period of time this adjusts itself and teachers magically spring out of thin air and fill the gap, or whether this is a structural problem that won't get fixed until someone decides they're going to fix it.
You know, my own view there is that it's probably a lag. So Vizag, as you mentioned, I was in Vizag recently. Frankly, I was quite inspired because Vizag had been to many, many years ago, and the Vizag of today
completely
is very dynamic. Yeah. People want to do fintech, they want to do blockchain. Yeah. It was just quite amazing. Yeah. And the quote, academies to teach this and that. So, but the promise and the fulfillment, there may be a lag. But I was encouraged by the fact that people are thinking ahead. And you're right, there will be a lag in terms of capability.
Any other questions from the? There's a question.
Bobby,
General
I had a
back there.
question.
Oh, forgive me.
No problem.
Apologies.
I have a political
You and then
question with economic consequences.
As long as it's not from
As
Amitabh.
all politics does. The Assistant Secretary Arun mentioned about the bookends, and Amitabh also mentioned, without saying bookends, about the underpaid workers, which of course is a problem we have in the United States as well, identical. So my question is this. Secretary of Defense, for example, recently, a year or so ago, changed the Pacific Ocean to the Indo-Pacific region, which is huge military it's a huge military statement, essentially intended to the South China Sea problem, with China in particular. Will India accept this opportunity that the United States has put on the table, although with even the recent 2+2 meeting that occurred in Delhi, that there be a kind of a collective move forward economically in a collaborative way, not just capitalistic way, but in a collaborative way?
Well, I think we have an Indian ambassador in the room who's better qualified to answer this than me.
I'm happy to include Sandeep, absolutely. Give the ambassador a microphone.
Sandeep, you want to take that? No, Sandeep, come on. You can.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
No, this is quite a sabotage. But anyway, I think I think that the answer is in the question, in the sense that the 2+2, which happened just a few days back in India, I think the outcome document, if you see, I think both sides are really committed to working together. And there were certain skeptics who said that there are spoilers in the relationship, such as Iran and Russia, and the maturity with which both sides handled the Iran and the Russia issue in the relationship, I think indicates that both are willing to cooperate. And as the former Secretary of State says, India-US relationship is the most important relationship for the next 100 years. And we're only talking of 2050.
No, and if I can, it's not my brief to answer that question really, but it's something that occupied my thoughts a lot when I was in India. And so whenever I got a chance to speak to anybody from the defense establishment in India, I always raise the question. And my own view is that this will turn on how the United States postures itself in relation to India. And so far, it's doing pretty well. India is historically very proud of its independence from sort of big power dependence. And there's still a certain amount of hesitation and skepticism. There's a reluctance to become part of the American sphere of influence. India wants to engage with the United States militarily, certainly, and in every other way, but wants to do so on its own terms. And historically, the US has not really had to deal with that kind of a situation. America's relationships with other countries have either been, we're the dominant partner, you're the junior partner, or you're the adversary and we're adversarial. So India represents a new kind of challenge for America. And so far, I've been quite impressed by how well the defense establishment in this country has recognized that, and in all kinds of communications with the Indians, as with the 2+2, has shown a willingness to treat India as a almost equal partner. And as long as that continues, I think the possibilities are limitless. There's one last question at the back, and then we'll break.
My name is Shiv Kumar. I run a technology startup company. My question actually is for Mr. Amitabh Kant.
No, Amitabh's not taking any more questions. Amitabh's not taking any more questions. You can ask him afterwards. So if you have a question for the panel.
Maybe Secretary Arun can answer this.
Okay.
So all the great definitive, progressive, constructive steps that are the building blocks for India to march towards the aspirations of 2050, how much of those building blocks are potentially reversible if there was an outcome in 2019 elections that's very different than what these agendas have been set forth by the current government? So I just want to know, what is the implication of a potential change, maybe to a coalition government coming up, that could derail and send India back from this growth agenda?
Actually, it's a good question for all three. Yeah. I think it's a good way to end the discussion.
I won't claim to be an expert on this topic, but the first observation I would make is that many Indian government programs have survived from one government to the next. So Aadhaar is a good example. It was set up by the previous government. This government adopted it. GST is another good example. And GST might have gone through too many cycles, but the point is that many of these programs do in fact survive governments. However, if, like in any parliamentary system, if you don't have a proper majority, then it's going to be more difficult to move forward, move forward strongly and rapidly. But in general, do I think any of these things will be reversed? I don't think so.
Vinita, when you make projections for your company, when you think as an entrepreneur about what you want to do next year, the year after next, and so on, do you pause at any point to think, I'm going to make this decision based on what the election result is going to be?
Not really, because we are in the consumer goods industry. Personal care penetration in India is at a very low level. Consumers are, so the consumer base is increasing. The number of people who are using branded consumer care products is increasing. So it's really not based on the election. Our projections are not based on the elections.
I was as an American talking about electoral dynamics or political stability doesn't seem a topic that we should be qualified to talk to the world about. But I know we're coming to the end, and I hope we'll get a chance to say anything. Just as a longstanding supporter both of Asia Society with deep roots in it, I kind of want to just thank everybody from the Asia Society for this whole season of India activities. I think for a lot of us, we've waited a long period of time to kind of see this degree of coordinated activities across the range of activities Asia Society covers. And for those of you that are here for this, please go stop and see the art exhibition downstairs. I think for all of us, if all of us, if all we'd done was sort of maybe buy more of that 25 years ago, it would have made life much easier.
You did pretty well, because a couple of pieces downstairs belong to him. And I was going to try to work this very cleverly into one of the questions. I failed to, so I'll come out with it quite clumsily. He used an expression to describe himself earlier before this discussion, which I think the Indians in this room, especially the NRIs, the non-resident Indians, would appreciate. Chip describes himself as the RNI, the resident non-Indian, which I think is a very elegant way to put it. Thank you from my side to members of the panel, and I'm going to invite Ashwini Tiwari of the State Bank of India to come up and do the formal thank yous.
Thank you, Chip, for making my job a little easier by thanking Asia Society in the beginning. It's a great start to the whole season of India. I was attending a conference in Beijing 2 years back. This was a US bank holding a China conference to do it every year, so some of you may guess that. But one of the hedge fund guys from the US made a comment. India is like, this question came up, China and India. It comes up everywhere. So the question was, what do you think India is doing and what China is doing? He said India is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So we kind of have to calculate all the time. And for 2050, as some of the panelists have pointed out, Mr. Khan pointed out, we probably need to take 5 steps forward, and definitely there'll be a step back, surely. Because we are a frothy democracy, we need to take everyone along, all opinions along. So taking that into view, I guess this is already happening. Mr. Khan did lay out in his very energetic and uplifting presentation all the building blocks which are put in place. Many of us know this, the young population, etc., but the kind of data points he put out, that is 2070, the 2030 figures, those were very, very revealing. So thank you, sir, for such a wonderful presentation. I also want to thank all the panelists here, starting with Chip Khai, Vanita, Mr. Arun Kumar, and Bobby. His simple questions were really enough to throw everyone off guard. It's just simple, direct questions, but yet it brought out so many unique perspectives, I would say, from the panel, starting from the land cost, which is surely an issue needs to be talked about, also to women's safety infrastructure, again, a very, very important issue, and also to Secretary Kumar's hopes. And I think this is already fructifying of US-India partnership on both sides of the Pacific as 2 pages of a book. So great perspectives brought out by the panel. I want to thank all of the panelists and Bobby. I want to thank all the audience here, because these questions which came from the audience, some of them were so good. And some of them were slightly difficult to answer, actually. So therefore, thank you all for being present. It's a long afternoon and asking such great questions. And again, I will finally thank Asia Society for organizing this, starting this off. Tom, thank you for setting the ball rolling, pointing out the bell is still the way to collect people here, despite all the digital talk. So great afternoon to begin this. The exhibition is down below, as Chip has pointed out, the Modern Progressives. It's a great exhibition. Mr. Krishan Khanna was to be here. I believe he's not here, But nevertheless, this is a great exhibition. Please take time out to see it. Have a great day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much.